gauge swatches. Okay, so here's my little topic of the day. I've been asked a few times lately. I've heard many conversations about it. To swatch or not to swatch? Well, I say it depends. And I think this is something that you will get very strong opinions about, mixed feelings, and, somebody might feel one way and feel very strongly about their expertise, and that's okay. We can all agree to disagree on whether or not you have to swatch for every project. And so I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I decide if I'm going to swatch for a project. I'm curious to hear how you decide if you're going to swatch for a project. Here's how I decide. First question, have I used the yarn before? Probably the most important question I ask myself, because if I've used it before, I know a lot about it, right? Regardless of the project. I know how it feels in my hands. I know how it knits into a fabric at a certain gauge. And I know how it washes. If I've had it a long time, I know how it wears. But I at least know how it blocks, because if I have a project, I've blocked it. I block everything. So number one, have I used the yarn before? Number two, have I used it in a similar stitch pattern? There could be a big difference between knitting a yarn solely in stockinette or using it for color work, whether it's mosaic or stranded color work, or using it for cables, or using it for just highly textured material. So have I used it, and have I used it in a similar way? And have I used it on a similar size needle? And sure, most of the time you're thinking, well, if it's the same yarn, of course I've probably used it within a size or two of your needle, something a little tighter, a little looser. But that could be different, especially if you're talking about something that is more popular, I think now, which is a really thin yarn, a lightweight yarn, and a big needle with a looser gauge. So you might have knit that fingering weight yarn for socks, or for a hat, something, or mittens, something where you really need a tighter gauge, and you'd never knit a fingering weight yarn at a 16 stitch gauge for socks, I don't think, unless you want some pretty loose socks. So I suppose never say never, but I think you're getting what I'm saying, which is now you want to use it for a love note, or you want to use it for an open, airy, drapey top that's going to have a really loose gauge with a really thin yarn. That's a different kind of behavior. So have I used the yarn? Have I used it in a similar stitch pattern? Have I used it on a similar size needles? If so far I'm saying yes, 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 guess what I'm doing? Less likely to swatch, okay? But that's not the only thing. Is it something where fit and size is really important? So have I used it on a cowl and now I'm going to use it on a whole sweater? Is that sweater a child sweater or an adult sweater? How much time am I going to put into it? Am I going to do a big enough swatch that I will get more information from it? Or do I just start the project and treat it like a swatch? These are my next set of questions. So for me, if it's an adult sweater, I am most likely to swatch. I don't want to put so many hours into it. But have I had experiences swatching and think, I did all this work swatching and it didn't really pan out? Yeah, I've had that happen too. And I'll probably maybe talk about that a little bit more with different specific sweaters, because I'm thinking of two. So some of it's going to depend. Did the designer give you enough information to do a swatch that's effective? Because if all the designer gave you was a stockinette gauge and you did it and you got it and you thought, I am good to go, and it's a heavily cabled sweater and your cable gauge is going to change a whole lot and it's not all taken into consideration, well, now you did all that work to swatch and you might still have challenges. Or for me, I've had yarns where I've used a different yarn for the color work of a yoke sweater than I did for the body. And I swatched, of course you can swatch in color work, but I had swatched just in the stockinette of the body. And I was going on this whole range of needles, like 5 different needle sizes. And it was not giving me the right kind of information. And then once I got to the color work, I had to size up like 3 or 4 needles. It was a huge, huge difference. So I am most likely to swatch for an adult sweater. I am most likely to swatch if I have not used a yarn before, or if I've used it in a very different way than I'm going to use it for this project. And I'm most likely to swatch if it's a project I think, oh, if I get into this project, I'm not going to be willing to frog it and treat it like a swatch. Then those are the things that have me more leaning toward doing a gauge swatch. And what I mean by am I willing to frog it is, if you really want to do a very informative, official swatch, and it's a colorwork sweater, for example, you're talking like a 6x6 swatch, 6 inches by 6 inches in colorwork pattern, and in the round, if you're knitting it in the round. And of course, if you're knitting small circumference, your gauge is going to be different than larger. So you're either pulling it across the back or you're doing a much, so to me, okay, I'm going to stop myself. To me, if I've got enough information, if I've done a stockinette swatch that's 4x4 and I'm comfortable with the fabric, which is really important to me as much as the gauge, I'm probably going to start that colorwork sweater. And if I get here and it's just not looking good, I'm going to rip it out. And that was a better swatch for me. And by better, I mean more informative than it would have been for me to do all this work to try to make an in the round swatch large enough in colorwork to be that informative. So that's just a little insight into me. And the other piece that I think is worthy of a longer conversation is also not just about getting gauge, and I've heard a lot of people talking about this lately, but getting the fabric you want. And a step further is when you are looking at patterns, instead of saying like I have a DK weight yarn, I'm going to only look at DK patterns. And then I've seen some people even argue with, the producer of the yarn or the local yarn shop owner, like this is DK, but it knits like a worsted. Well, yes, it does. And if you're looking at gauge for your pattern, instead of just weight of yarn for your pattern, you are going to be the one to decide what pattern you match with what yarn. It doesn't have to be bulky with a bulky pattern. If you have a pattern that's a 12 stitch per 4-inch gauge and it says it's a fingering pattern, that's up to you. It could be a bulky pattern. See what kind of fabric you're going to get. See if the fabric matches the project. The yarn can get the gauge to get the fabric. And that, folks, is how I would look at swatching, creating a fabric, looking at a gauge, choosing a pattern, creating an object that is a successful finished object for you.